Hi everyone, I hope this finds you experiencing God's peace in the face of these challenging times. In many ways, if the events of this year were a movie script, it would be hard to believe. From devastating bushfires at the start of the year, through to the first phase of COVID-19, which saw us experience our first lockdown period, that soon led to our second lockdown period, and the significant restrictions on gathering, social interaction, and our work, study, and worship. It feels like we've been in isolation for most of the year. Then, of course, just recently, much of Melbourne was affected by contaminated water damage and power outages throughout the city due to severe storms. The impacts of this year's events have had serious consequences in so many ways, whether it be economically, loss of life, issues connected to our social isolation, sickness, mental health struggles, the list goes on. Unfortunately, this is not a movie script. It is very real. During these unusual times, those of us who are spiritually minded have been reflecting on what God is up to. I suppose the challenge of wrestling with this question is seeking an answer based on our own circumstances and experiences. And this is valid, but we also need to consider others who find themselves in very different situations than ourselves. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, the Apostle Paul writes, "And we know that in all things God works for those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." My understanding of this verse is that God works in all things, in all situations, not just isolated incidences, not just in good times or poor times, but in all times for our good. In that sense, there's a word of comfort for us in this passage. God works in all situations for our good. But we can't leave out the second part of this verse, which includes loving God and being called to his purpose. The challenge here is even when things are difficult, we need to keep trusting God and obeying his commands, believing that regardless of the situation, he will ultimately bring about good, both for our own lives and for the world. So how is God working for our good in this COVID-19 crisis? Despite the limitations and frustrations of lockdown, some of us have been minimally impacted by the effects of the pandemic, and for varying reasons and circumstances are not experiencing the stresses that others are. For some, the pandemic has allowed us to engage in a more restful and different rhythms, having been forced to slow down with so many activities restricted. Some of these rhythms have allowed us to reevaluate and realign our priorities around faith and life, and we can give thanks for these positive changes. I would also observe that this time in lockdown and isolation has allowed some of us to reflect on our calling and vocation, to really wrestle with God's purpose for our life. So for some, there are blessings to be found in this current situation. But others are having a very different experience. And in fact, for most of the oppressed people in the world, the pandemic has certainly not been a time of rest and reflection. Closer to home here in Australia and in our own state, many have been personally impacted by the effects of COVID. Whether it be by the virus itself, others of us have sadly had loved ones die in aged care or hospital without having any opportunity to farewell them. Many are dealing with the stresses of separation from family due to restrictions and border closures. Others are experiencing great financial stress and the loss of dreams and aspirations. How is God working for the good of people in these situations? What is God up to? My honest answer is I don't know. But what I do know is that God is love, and he wants us, those who claim to follow him, to be the hands and feet of his love in our neighbourhoods and our world. So in the midst of this time we find ourselves in, we need to look for ways to be God's love, to be a blessing to others, particularly to those who are struggling. May we each seek to find ways of being God's good news to those around us. May he give us the eyes to see and ears to hear how we can minister his grace, compassion, and generosity. And may we all experience the peace and comfort his love and kindness offers us. May God bless you.